The sound of screeching tires jolted me from my evening routine. When I rushed outside, my worst nightmare stood before me. Karen's reckless teenage son had plowed his shiny sports car straight through my wooden fence. But instead of apologizing, he pointed at me as if I had caused it. Within minutes, Karen was outside screaming that my unsafe property was to blame. And when the cops arrived, I braced myself for the worst, because in this neighborhood, the rules never worked in my favor. Yet that night, the truth would twist against them in a way they never expected. I had lived in that neighborhood for years, quietly minding my own business, but always under the unblinking eyes of the HOA and its self-proclaimed Queen Karen. She wasn't just any HOA member. She had influence, friends in city offices, and a smug belief that the world revolved around her. To her, I wasn't just a neighbor, I was an easy target. My home was older, my fence weathered, and I didn't look like the picture-perfect residence she surrounded herself with. Over time, I had gotten used to her nitpicking letters about the color of my door, complaints about my lawn, and passive-aggressive comments at community meetings. But this incident was different. Property damage wasn't just about appearances, it was about money, responsibility, and the law. The car that smashed into my fence wasn't just any vehicle. It was Karen's pride and joy, her son's shiny sports car, purchased more for status than necessity. It tore through the wood like paper, leaving splinters scattered across the yard. And when Karen stormed out, she immediately twisted the story. Her voice carried over the entire street as she insisted my fence was too close to the road, too weak, too dangerous. The neighbors gathered like vultures, some nodding along, others quietly watching the chaos unfold. I knew from experience that in disputes like this, fairness rarely tipped my way. But what Karen and her son didn't know was that fences weren't just decorative, they were legally protected boundaries. And what they also didn't realize was that I kept meticulous records of every HOA notice, every city permit, and every property line confirmation. They thought they could shift the blame onto me. They had no idea the storm they had just walked into. As the dust settled and headlights flickered against my broken fence, Karen's son strutted around like the victim. He pointed at the wooden planks scattered across his scratched hood, claiming the fence had jumped out at him. Karen, standing by his side, fueled his story, declaring that my property was hazardous and that her son deserved compensation. The cops arrived soon after, 2 officers, their flashing lights painting the street red and blue. And here was the moment I dreaded. Experience had taught me that when Karen spoke, people listened. She had connections, she had influence, and most of all, she knew how to play the role of the concerned mother. She launched into her performance dares, welling up as she painted a picture of her son, an innocent young driver terrorized by my unsafe property. She insisted that my fence jutted out too far, that it violated HOA codes, and that I had ignored warnings to fix it. The crowd murmured. The cops scribbled in their notepad, and I felt the familiar sinking in my stomach. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about who was believed in this neighborhood. That was rarely me. But as Karen spun her tale, one of the officers stepped away, radio in hand, calling for backup. The other examined the scene closely, measuring skid marks, examining the shattered fence, and taking photos. My heart raced. Were they buying her story, or were they seeing through it? Then came Karen's fatal mistake. She claimed that the HOA had already issued me notices about this fence. That's when I calmly walked inside, grabbed my neatly organized binder, and brought out every single piece of documentation. Permits from the city, HOA approvals, even photos showing my fence exactly where it had stood for years. Never once in violation, the officer flipped through the papers, his expression shifting. He turned back to Karen, who suddenly faltered, her confidence cracking. Her son, however, grew louder, insisting that his expensive car was ruined because of me. He pointed at me with a smirk, muttering under his breath about how people like me didn't belong in this neighborhood. That sting hit harder than the crash. It wasn't just arrogance, it was racism, plain and ugly. And the neighbors who had gathered knew it too. Some shifted uncomfortably, others looked down at their shoes. But the words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning every excuse Karen had tried to build. The officers exchanged a look. One quietly asked me to step aside while they spoke to Karen and her son. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The tension broke when the officer raised his voice clear. firm, and undeniable. He announced that the car had not only damaged my property, but had also been speeding recklessly. The skid marks proved it, the angle of the crash confirmed it, and my documents destroyed Karen's entire narrative. Karen's face flushed red. Her son's jaw dropped, and the crowd leaned in closer. The officer continued, stating that I was fully within my rights as a property owner, that my fence was legally placed, and that I bore zero responsibility for the accident. Instead, the blame fell entirely on the driver Karen's son. The air buzzed with shock. Karen tried one last desperate attempt, claiming her son was too young to face such consequences, that it wasn't fair, that I should just let it go. But the officer didn't budge. He called in a tow truck, and within minutes, the shiny sports car that had been a symbol of Karen's status was being hauled away, crumpled and humiliated. The sight of it hit Karen harder than any argument I could have made. Her son raged, cursing under his breath, but there was nothing he could do. The law, for once, was not on their side, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight shift not just against Karen, but against the injustice I had endured for years. The next morning, the shattered pieces of my fence still lay across the yard, but something had changed. Neighbors who once stayed silent now stopped by offering help, tools, and even sympathy. Some admitted they had always known how Karen operated, but this time, the mask had slipped too far. Her son's words had exposed not just arrogance, but prejudice, and people could no longer look away. Karen avoided me after that. No more passive-aggressive letters, no more stares at community meetings. Her power had cracked, and though my fence would take weeks to repair, something far more valuable had been rebuilt in my dignity, my place in that neighborhood, and the truth that even against odds, justice could still prevail. As I hammered new boards into place, I thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I hadn't kept records, if the officers hadn't been thorough, if neighbors hadn't witnessed the truth. Racism often thrives in shadows, hidden behind excuses and influence. But that night, under flashing lights, it was dragged into the open and defeated. I realized then that fences don't just mark boundaries of property. Sometimes they mark the line between lies and truth, between prejudice and justice. And as the tow truck carried Karen's son's car away, I couldn't help but wonder, how many more times will people like me have to fight to be believed, to be respected, to be seen as equal? Because until that answer changes, these stories will keep repeating, one fence, one injustice, one battle at a time.